When one surveys the wisdom literature, time is a topic frequently encountered. As is often the case, the proverbs and pithy sayings offer advice of all types, often contradictory, in helping us understand and process our experience in time. Theodore Roosevelt once said, 9/10 of wisdom is being wise in time. As one might imagine, Ben Franklin has a number of nuggets of wisdom attributed to him, including such warnings as, "You may delay, but time will not," "Lost time is never found again," and of course, the observation that time is money. Perhaps this last was inspired by the works of the Greek philosopher Theophrastus, who offered, "Time is the most valuable thing a man can spend." This wisdom is often tinged with regret, as when William Penn opined, "Time is what we most want, but what we use worst." Our awareness of time and the amount of it left to us has long been a source of existential angst, as is eloquently stated in Haruki Murakami's lament. Unfortunately, the clock is ticking. The hours are going by. The past increases, the future recedes. Possibilities decreasing, regrets mounting. Among all the wise sayings, though, there is a special group that are centered on a single moment, one time more relevant than any other: now. From this rich cache of aphorisms, time management gurus and college professors urge their charges to take up what lies in front of them in the moment, as if there were no other time. From Philip Stanhope, "Know the true value of time. Snatch, seize, and enjoy every moment of it. No idleness, no laziness, no procrastination. Never put off till tomorrow what you can do today." Bill Keane is famous in part for having observed, "Yesterday's the past, tomorrow's the future, but today is a gift. That's why it's called the present." Mother Teresa, known for her impact on the poor and destitute of India, advised, "Yesterday is gone. Tomorrow has not yet come. We have only today. Let us begin." Kurt Vonnegut observed, "Here we are, trapped in the amber of the moment. There is no why." Even George Harrison, one-time Beatle and student of Eastern philosophy, recognized, "It's being here, now, that's important. There's no past, there's no future. Time is a very misleading thing. All there is ever is the now. We can gain experience from the past, but we can't relive it. We can hope for the future, but we don't know if there is one." All of this, I think, can be summed up in a common, offhanded remark that might, in its own way, capture more thinking on the philosophy of time than we might imagine. As they say, there is no time like the present. In the history of the philosophy of time, there are any number of temporal idealists who would agree with this sentiment, if not in a colloquial way, as an accurate description of the nature of time, lacking a future or past, but only consisting of the now. Others, temporal realists, would disagree, claiming that all times are the same, equally real and capable of containing events. As the industrial world turned from the Victorian era of steam-powered machines and classical physics to the modern age of electromagnetism and relativity, the question of time and whether it exists would once again come to the forefront of philosophical thought through the writings of a German physicist and an English philosopher.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 10.5, Supplemental. A Brief History of Telling Time. Philosophy of Time, Part 3. When last we left our daring voyage of discovery, we had been introduced to Einstein's reformulation of physics with his theories of special and general relativity, and the accompanying construct of what he called space-time, a four-dimensional framework in which all physical events happen. While our goal in this brief supplemental series on time is not to delve into the details of Einstein's rewriting of our understanding of the physical world on a scale of the very large or very fast, it would be useful to say a few more things about the idea before returning to our discussion of time, as it will have a significant impact on how our discussion progresses. The first thing we should talk about is why it took so long for someone to come up with this idea. When one looks at the equations of special and general relativity, it becomes very clear that the consequences of this reformulation will only become apparent in one of two cases. Either when a system moves at a speed approaching that of the speed of light, or when the system is near an object possessing a very large mass. For most of the 200 or so years between the publication of Newton's Principia and the development of Maxwell's equations, none of the systems examined in detail really met either of these criteria. It was only with the advancements in observing technology and timing systems that things of this sort could be studied in detail, and anomalies between the behavior predicted by Newton's laws and what was observed for a system could be reliably documented. It should also be noted that when one inputs a speed far below that of light, or has masses that are very small, and put those into Einstein's equations, they reduce to Newton's equations, a requirement if Einstein's formulation was to be taken seriously. The second thing is the reminder that due to the fact that there are no longer any preferred or absolute reference frames, two observers moving relative to each other will observe and measure intervals between events as having different spatial separations and/or temporal durations. The only interval that will be agreed on by both observers in their individual frames of reference will be that of the space-time interval. In other words, the separation between the event in this new four-dimensional space-time, and that will be the same, or, in the language of physics, invariant. Finally, and this is something of a new idea, to understand which events an observer might be able to observe and may be able to influence, a new tool is created called a light cone. If one sort of imagines space-time as a great big block, an observer can be thought to occupy a single point consisting of three spatial dimensions and one modified temporal dimension. As the observer moves in space-time, this point, and hence his coordinates, will change. Now the challenge here is to think of the four-dimensional block within our three-dimensional experience. And to do that, we have to leave out one of the spatial dimensions so that we can represent the modified time dimension. So in your imagination, if you think of a cube that represents a certain region of space-time close to an observer, who can be thought of as residing at any given instant at the center of the cube, the plane containing the observer that is parallel to the top and bottom of the cube will represent all events happening at the same instant in time, but at other locations. Events located below the observer in the cube can be thought of as having happened in the past, while points and events above the observer in the cube can be thought of as being in the future. If the observer doesn't move spatially, his or her path in the cube would be straight up through the cube as time advanced. And we'll have a little more on this as we move on. So in this picture, what is it that an observer can observe? Well, it turns out that information can travel no faster than the speed of light through the block of spacetime. Thus, if an event were to take place at the same instant as our observer, but at some other location, the observer will not be able to observe it in that instant, because it will take the information some amount of time to travel from the event to the observer. An example of this might be the light emitted from the surface of the sun. Given light speed, 300,000 kilometers per second, and the sun's distance from the Earth, 150 million kilometers, the light takes roughly 500 seconds to travel across the space between the two to an observer here. As such, the observer here isn't observing the sun in the present, but as it was 8 minutes and 20 seconds ago. The further away something is, the longer it takes for that information to travel to us, and the further back in the past we're observing it. It's kind of mind-blowing to think of the fact that the further out we look, when we look at a star, we're looking at it in the past. That's just an amazing thing to contemplate. To represent what a given observer can see from a particular point in space-time, we use what's known as a light cone. I'll post a diagram to the podcast website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com. But what it represents is a combination of two things. First, there's a cone opening downward from the observer's position into the cube. The edges of this cone represent how fast light can travel through spacetime, and since it's oriented below the observer, the area inside the cone represents all events the observer can see from the past. Hence, it's known as the observer's past light cone. Above the observer's point in space and time is a second cone, opening upwards, with the sides of the cone again representing the path of light traveling away from the observer. The volume inside this cone represents those points in space-time in the future that would be able to observe something the observer does or be affected by an event in the observer's reference frame, and thus this is known as the future light cone. For two observers within each other's light cones, but moving with respect to each other, events will be observed to occur at different times and thus can be said to be time-like separated from each other. Events outside the light cone, which might only be observed in the future, will be observed by two different observers to occur at a different spatial separation, and thus they're called space-like separated. As a note to close this introductory portion of our discussion, the question of whether space-time is a real thing is unresolved. While we certainly have talked about it as if it was, we haven't attempted to talk about what it might be if that's the case. As the debate between Aristotle and Zeno made clear, it can't be made up of a collection of infinitesimal points because then motion can never take place. If this isn't the case, then it seems like space-time must be some sort of continuous medium or thing that can't be broken into smaller constituent parts. One of the most intriguing areas of active research in physics is the attempt to determine if space-time is quantized in the same way matter and other things are. As of the date of this recording, such efforts have gone unrewarded, with Einstein's theories of relativity stubbornly resisting all attempts to be unified with the other grand framework of physics, quantum mechanics. So let's get back to talking about time. By this point in the consideration of the problem of determining what time is, or even whether it exists, the focus had shifted back to attempting to understand the passage of time. As stated in the initial episode of this topic, the idea of time flowing is ubiquitous, but also ambiguous, as one wonders if we're the ones moving through time with events remaining stationary, or if we're the ones standing still, with events coming to us out of the future, coinciding with us for an instant, and then moving into the past. Einstein's formulation seems to suggest that objects move through a reality that allows for an experience of time passing. But one should remember, in the spirit of scientific instrumentalism, that this is just a mathematical model derived to explain the various observations made of different systems. While it is tempting for us to say that this model is an accurate description of reality, which of course is the position of scientific realism, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, as one can see when considering the supposed reality of Newton's absolute space and time, both of which are now consigned to the annals of the history of science. At about the same time Minkowski was expanding on the work of Einstein, an English philosopher by the name of J.M. Ellis McTaggart wrote a powerfully influential work titled The Unreality of Time, that once again argued that time was a construct of the human mind and did not actually exist. Now, McTaggart was a student of Hegel's, and thus inherited his idealism along the lines of Kant. Published in 1908, The Unreality of Time attempts to demonstrate through the use of logical argument that our perception of time is an illusion. To do this, he asks his reader to consider two different views of time. The first view, which he calls the A-series interpretation, arranges events in a dynamical sense, to use a term we defined in our last episode. In his words, the A-series is, quote, the series of positions running from the far past through the near past to the present, and then from the present to the near future and the far future, end quote. In this expression, the word position is understood to apply to an event's location on a temporal timeline rather than something in space. Maybe something McTaggart would call a moment. To break this down a bit, dynamic time supposes that there is a special time we call now that picks out what is going on around us. The future and the events associated with it are coming to pass, and what is happening now moves into the past immediately afterwards. Time passes through the present, which, as we mentioned in the introduction, there is no time like. This is a picture of time rooted in the idea that there is change in the universe, and that change is completely wrapped up in the change of time. In this view, events can be said to have properties like pastness and futureness that can change as the event's relationship to now changes. McTaggart also defines what he calls a B-series interpretation of time. In this, events are like things on a calendar that are fixed and set in relationship to each other. This is a static view of time, where the temporal relations between events are completely locked in and unchangeable. In this view, there are no properties of pastness or futureness that can change because all events are fixed in place in space-time. In other words, they don't become more in the past and less in the future. They are when they are, and they don't move. Someone who subscribes to the dynamic or A-series view of time thinks that time is real, and so is the passage of time. A person who believes that the B-series description is right thinks that time exists, but that the experience of the passage of time is based completely within the human psyche. According to McTaggart, these two can be thought of as being related to each other in one of two ways. He writes, quote, "It is very usual to contemplate time by the help of spatial movement. But spatial movement in which direction? The movement of time consists in fact that later and later terms pass into the present, or, which is the same fact expressed another way, that presentness passes to later and later terms. If we take it the first way, we are taking the B series as sliding along a fixed A series. If we take it the second way, we are taking the A series as sliding along the B series. In the first case, time presents itself as a movement from future to past. In the second case, it presents itself as a movement from earlier to later. And this explains why we say that events come out of the future, while we say that we ourselves move towards the future. For each man identifies him especially with his present state, as against his future or his past, since it is the only one which he is directly perceiving. And this leads him to say that he is moving with the present towards later events. And as those events are now future, he says that he is moving towards the future. Thus, the question as to the movement of time is ambiguous. But if we ask what the movement of either series is, the question is not ambiguous. The movement of the A series along the B series is from earlier to later. The movement of the B series along the A series is future to past. End quote. Okay, so what's McTaggart's argument against this? The first thing McTaggart does is to point out that when we talk about the reality of time, we talk about it in both A and B series terms. If we have two events, he called them M and N, we will have a relationship to us in an A series sense that they will be either in the future, present, or past. And then another relationship that they will have with each other in a B series sense, i.e., one will be earlier than the other. While the B series relationship will not change, hence the label of static time, the A-series relationship to us will. Events in our future will eventually come into our present, losing their futureness, and then move into the past, gaining the property of pastness. In his view, for the flow of time to exist, and thus for change to exist, you have to have both the A and B series properties as real things. He starts by attacking the A-series view of things by questioning whether the temporal properties of futureness and pastness can be thought of as being real. He does this through an argument that's logical based on what are known as truth conditions of a statement made about an event from an A-series perspective. When we talk about events from this dynamic perspective, we are forced to use tense as part of our descriptive language to establish the statement's truth. If we think of a statement such as, the United States will celebrate the 250th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence in 2026, this statement relies on the word will to establish its future tense. The statement is true, but only for certain states of the present. If we are before 2026, the statement with this tense is true, but if we say it is after 2026, the statement will be false unless the tense is changed to something indicating the past. In other words, the truth condition of the statement in the dynamic or A-series view of time depends on the condition of the present, i.e., the statement is true if the event is future in the present. This means that to ascertain whether the statement is true or not, we need to know if the event is future in the present. Now, in a somewhat complicated argument, McTaggart then asserts that you then have to extend that to another level, and then again, and over and over and over. This is what is known as an infinite regress. This idea that you sort of have to establish tense with respect to the present, but then you got to establish present in respect to other things. As such, he says, there's no way to fully specify the truth conditions for a tense statement in only A-series terms. You can only end the regress by bringing in B-series locators, such as saying, for all years prior to 2026, the event will be true. McTaggart says that since you can't get away from this problem of infinite regress when trying to establish the truth of a statement about an event in just A-series terms, there's no logically coherent way to talk about tense, and thus a dynamic view of time is fundamentally flawed. Moreover, there's another difficulty with the dynamic view. The properties of future and past are changeable in a quantity. As we approach 2026, the futureness of the event of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence gets less. On the other hand, the pastness of other events, say the event of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, gets greater. In the second case especially, it seems counterintuitive to think of an event in the past getting more past because we tend to think of events in the past as being fixed and immutable, and thus the properties of a past event shouldn't change. In addition to this argument, McTaggart argues that since the flow of time is the essential property of change, one must subscribe to an A theory of time in addition to a B theory of time for time to really exist, as the primary property of time in human experience is that it flows. Since, at least from his point of view, he's shown that the A-series view is not supportable, he concludes that time cannot exist within reality. Now, in my research to date, I've not been able to determine how much McTaggart knew about Einstein's theory of special relativity when he wrote his influential essay. It is certainly true that the theory's publication and subsequent discussion would have been confined to fairly esoteric journals in the theoretical physics area and any experimental work to support it. And it should be noted that this experimental work, while compelling, was pretty limited in 1908. In fact, as we'll discuss in a later episode, it could be argued that it wasn't until 1921 and Arthur Eddington's influential paper and essay that relativity burst forth from the pages of scientific journals into a broader consciousness. Thus, it's not unlikely that McTaggart wouldn't have known about Einstein's work. Nevertheless, McTaggart's essay was profoundly influential as it provided the first really solid, logical argument for the philosophical position of temporal idealism. As near as I can tell, the vast majority of the work in philosophy of time in the 20th and 21st centuries have been related in some way to McTaggart's construction of the problem. The first response to McTaggart that attempts to preserve the reality of time in a dynamic sense is something known as presentism. First put forward in the early 1920s, presentism argues that it is only the now that is real. There is no reality to either the future or the past. They exist, as Augustine might say, only in our memories and imaginations. Nevertheless, the dynamic nature of the present is a real thing, with events coming into being as real things to be experienced. This allows for a dynamic view of time without running into the logical paradoxes McTaggart brings up. There are, however, a few problems that arise in presentism. The first is that things that exist in the present cease to exist once they are no longer in the present. So, if you think of something that you remember from the past, say a favorite restaurant or hangout place that was bulldozed to make way for some new thing, the presentist would say that the thing doesn't exist. Even though you can describe the restaurant and even your experiences there, if you accept the presentist position, you can't say that it exists, even in memory. But if you're able to talk about it, but it doesn't exist, what are you actually talking about? The presentist might respond that you're talking about your memory of the restaurant rather than the thing itself, but that seems to be a pretty fine distinction. Another problem is that by reducing the experience of time to an infinite series of instants, the presentist is once again susceptible to Zeno's paradox known as the arrow. If you recall, this said that by reducing the change in time to an instant, all motion is nullified, and therefore the world is reduced to objects permanently at rest, and thus change is eliminated. The most devastating argument against presentism, however, is the idea of simultaneity in relativity theory. Recall, according to Einstein's theory, one that's been extraordinarily well tested, observers in different reference frame will observe events occurring at different times. A pair of events, say two flashing lights as we discussed in the last episode, might happen in my reference frame at the same time, but not in your reference frame at the same time. According to presentism, the events would be both real in my present, but at least one would not be real in yours, or vice versa if we were to do the analysis from your frame of reference instead of mine. It's hard to see how the same event can be both real and not real. It should be noted, as is often the case with philosophical ideas, there are versions of presentism that allow for the past to be real, and other versions which suggest that relativity theory is wrong in its representation of reality. From this reader's perspective, these positions seem to be rather post hoc, and are really seeming to reach a bit in order to deal with fairly legitimate objections to the argument's fundamental underlying structure. Now, you may not agree with that, and I would encourage you to go out and do some reading on your own, but that's kind of how I see it. Another way to respond to McTaggart is an idea known as Eternalism. This philosophical position accepts McTaggart's rejection of a dynamic or A-series view of time, but doesn't agree with his assertion that time doesn't exist if there's only a B-series view. According to the Eternalist, the natural world may be thought of as one huge block of events, each with its own spatio-temporal position. Think of a big chunk or a big block of space-time. Objects are said to occupy paths through this block of space-time, and thus exist eternally at all places along the path. Thus, in this view, there are no tenses. Using our example from earlier, you couldn't say that your favorite restaurant used to exist back in 1998 before it was bulldozed. Instead, that you could say that the restaurant was open from 1992 to 1998 at that corner of the, say, like Main and Elm, and that it still exists on those dates at that position. It exists before the bank was built in its place, something that we could say exists from 1998 until it fell victim to the 2008 economic crisis. After a period of inoccupancy, when the building exists empty and without a tenant from 2008 to 2011. A new business, an art gallery displaying and selling local work, exists from 2011 to 2020. In the eternalist view, all of these things exist at their appropriate times and locations and in permanent relation to each other as required by a B-series or static view of time. In other words, the restaurant exists before the bank exists before the art gallery. The temporal properties of objects, therefore, do not change. Change in this picture can be thought of as the experience of perceiving the world as being in one eternally fixed way at one instant and in a somehow different eternally fixed way in the next. You would exist eternally as something that spanned coordinates in time from the date of your conception to the date of your death, with varying spatial coordinates corresponding to how you moved about. To visualize this, each object in the universe creates a worm-like path through space-time. The eternalist view treats time very much like space, where past and future are just temporal ways of locating an object or event in time, but like one might locate an object in space by saying that it is to the right or left of some other object. As such, now isn't just a special locator anymore, any more than here would be a special locator. Instead of saying there would be no time like the present, we would say that all times are like the present, existing eternally, each with its own set of space-time coordinates. By being based on a static view of the B-series, eternalism completely avoids McTaggart's infinite regression of locating an object using tense and truth conditions. If the bank in our example exists on the corner of Main and Elm on June 21st, 2006, it always exists there on that date, and so the proposition is always true, unlike the case in an A-series. Now, there are some interesting consequences of the eternalist position. First, we exist eternally everywhere on our worm-like path through space-time. While we may only be able to receive sensory input at our present spatio-temporal location, that doesn't mean we only exist at that moment in space. Rather, we exist as a spatio-temporally extended being, all the same person at all the locations in space-time. As attractive as this position might be, there are certain drawbacks to it as well. The first has to do with fatalism and free will. In short, fatalism is the idea that all events, past and future, are previously and eternally determined and not susceptible to change. In a truly predetermined system, there can be no such thing as free will. If we imagine eternalism as occurring in a block universe of space-time where all events always exist, then our path through space-time is preordained in some way. As such, it's difficult to reconcile eternalism with a non-fatalistic worldview, and with it, human free will. For some, this is actually not a contradiction, as they believe such things, like time, are illusions, but for most, the idea of giving up free will may be a bridge too far. It should be noted that this idea is different from that of determinism, which claims that all future events are determined solely by laws of physics and causation only, and thus free will is an illusion for that reason. That, however, is a topic for another podcast episode. Along the same lines is how one deals with causality in this sort of a paradigm. If time is static, then one can no longer say that one thing causes another, as that would imply the necessity of changing time. For example, Newton's second law of motion says that force causes acceleration. Acceleration, however, is the change in an object's velocity with respect to a change in time, something that's no longer happening. Hence, the best we can do is say that accelerations, based on our observational evidence, are strongly statistically correlated with instances of net force. Thus, science, in this picture, is little more than discovering statistical correlation between things with no actual sense of causation. This runs pretty counter to a lot of the assumptions regarding scientific inquiry and the performing of experiments. It should be noted that some eternalists, especially those with backgrounds in physics, suggest that it is causality that established the specific events along all of the block universe. In other words, the events in the future portion of the block are established according to the appropriate natural laws that are then discovered as beings travel through the block, observing the relationship between eternally established events. Some go so far as to suggest that causation no longer has to be thought of as a one-way thing, something that goes from present to future only. We'll discuss the arrow of time shortly, but the argument here is that there is actually no preferred direction of time movement, and therefore no specifically established direction of causality. As such, it would be possible for future events to cause things in the past. If this is the case, some physicists see backwards causality, as I might coin such a term, as an explanation for many of the counterintuitive phenomena in quantum mechanics, such as what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. The ability of things like electrons to become entangled so that a future observation of a part of the system will result in a collapse of the wave function for the entire system, even if that collapse would suggest a transmission of information at a speed faster than that of light. Along these lines, it's interesting to note that Richard Feynman, when studying under Wheeler at Princeton, and then again later when developing renormalization theory and his famous diagrams at Cornell, realized that an antiparticle moving forward in time could just as easily be thought of as its actual particle traveling backwards in time. In another response to these two criticisms, there is a modification of the block universe idea that says that the present and the past exist in a static way, but that the future does not. This is usually referred to as the growing block universe. In this sense, the future is created as time moves forward. How this takes place, however, is not well explained in this idea. But one thought might be that as the universe expands, space-time is extended by the expansion. Just as the volume of space increases to be filled with matter as dictated by various physical laws, so is time expanded to be filled by events. This would allow for change in an otherwise static universe based on present to future causation, while eliminating the possibility of changing past events, as would be the case in McTaggart's view of a dynamic model of time. The difficulty of this approach is again how to deal with the issue of simultaneity in the theory of relativity. If one of our listeners has a background in the philosophy of time and would like to weigh in on the topic, you can leave messages at our website or on our Facebook page, and we'll be happy to feature a response in a later episode of the podcast. Okay, so to move forward, let's look at a few topics that are often related to the flow of time. The first is usually called the thermodynamic argument. If you look at the laws of physics, it turns out that they actually work just as well whether one runs time forwards or backwards. An example of this some of you might have seen are the equations that govern simple projectile motion. If you think of throwing a ball from an elevated platform, say from a balcony, one of the things you can figure out is how long it will take for the ball to hit the ground. When you set up the equations to solve for this, you get an equation that is quadratic in form, meaning that you usually have to use the quadratic formula, that nemesis of algebra students of all stripes. When the formula is applied, it always gives two answers, in this case representing the time of flight for the ball. In the case of the ball thrown off the balcony, one of these answers will be positive while the other will be negative. In other words, you'll get a positive time and a negative time. The positive answer corresponds to the time from the moment when the ball leaves the thrower's hand until it hits the ground. So what does the negative time means? Well, usually we tell students that it's unphysical as you can't run time backwards. Another way to interpret it, however, is that it's the amount of time it would take for the ball to come from the ground up to the thrower's hand with the proper velocity. In other words, if we ran the clock backwards, we could think of the ball as leaving the thrower's hand and going back to the ground behind him while speeding up. There's nothing in the equations of motion that would prevent this solution other than our assertion that time has to run forward. So, if there's nothing in our physical models of the world that would indicate a direction for the arrow of time, as it is usually called, why do we have that arrow as having to point in a given direction, what we might think of as forwards or towards the future? Now, this, of course, also brings back up the question of whether such a dynamic model of time actually exists, one in which it passes or moves, and whether that actually happens. The usual argument brought up from a physics standpoint has to do with something known as entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. So let's take a look at these two things in reverse order. The second law of thermodynamics says that for any physical process, there's a quantity called entropy that must either stay the same or increase when it is calculated for both the system and its surrounding environment. And that's an important caveat right there. You got to include them both. Now, there are a couple of things we need to sort of understand here right off the bat. First, note that this is a law, not a theory. What that means is that while it's been proposed based on empirical evidence, it only describes what systems do, not why they do that. Second, entropy is usually described as a measure of the disorder of a system, which is actually not the technical description of the quantity. So what we need to do is break that down a little bit. The most common example for a system increasing its disorder is a glass of water that has a drop of ink fall into it. At first, the ink, being a bit denser than the water, remains together as it sinks into the glass of water. But before very long, the process of diffusion begins to spread the ink molecules apart. This process continues until the particles of ink are more or less evenly spread out through the water. It may take some time, but eventually you get there. The end state is more disordered since we no longer have a region where we just have ink molecules and another with just water molecules. Once the water and the ink are mixed, the second law of thermodynamics states that the system and the surrounding environment will never move back to a more ordered state, i.e., one in which the ink molecules and water molecules are separated. The problem with this description, while accurate, is that it neglects what's really going on to make that happen. To resolve this, we really need to dig into what entropy is. When you look at the system, there can be said that the system has a certain number of states that it can be in. An example of this might be a coin, something that can either be in one of two states, if that's our system, either heads or tails. Now, in most cases, a system will have an equal probability to be in any one of its possible states. In the example of our coin, it has a 50% chance to be in a head state and a 50% chance to be in a tail state. If the system is allowed to organize itself, it will randomly switch between the states available to it. For our coin, if we flip it a large number of times, it will come up heads about half the time and tails the other half. Okay, so far so good, I hope. Following along? Okay. What the second law of thermodynamics says is that physical processes will behave in such a way as to increase the entropy of a system and the surrounding environment, or at least keep it the same. Another way to say this, then, is that physical processes occur so as to increase the possible number of states available to the system and the environment surrounding it. Using our coin example, a physical process will act so that instead of having one coin, we might add a second or a third, whatever, might be the case. This would mean that we would have more possible states. In this case, those states would be, if we had two coins, heads heads, heads tails, tails heads, and finally, of course, tails tails. What you want to see here is that each of these states has the same probability of occurring if we were to flip the two coins, 25%. But here's what's really interesting. Let's say that the two coins are absolutely indistinguishable from each other, and that we could not track which one was which when they got flipped. That would mean that we couldn't keep track of which of the two middle states, heads tails and tails heads, was which. All we can tell is that one coin is heads and that the other is tails. So what that means is the chance of us observing a state where one coin is heads and one coin is tails is 50%. And that's less ordered than the more ordered matched pairs. And those are only, 25% probable. If we were to do this with 3 or more coins, the chance of 3 heads coming up would now only be 1/8. For 4 coins, the chance of all the coins coming up with heads is 1/16. In contrast, the chance of coming up with 2 heads and 2 tails, on the other hand, it actually turns out to be 6 out of 16. It's 6 times more probable to observe that state. Now, in this example, the most disordered state of the system is 2 heads and 2 tails. And that's 6 times more likely to be arrived at than one of the more ordered states. This clustering towards the outcome of 2 heads and 2 tails is not because these states are preferred by the system, but rather because, assuming that the coins are indistinguishable from each other again, there are more occurrences of the 2 heads and 2 tails states. As the number of states increases, this trend continues. When we look at something like a glass of water, which has a truly staggering number of atoms, and a drop of ink with another truly staggering number of atoms, it's easy to see that the number of possible states would be beyond astronomical, and the overwhelming number of those states would look like ink molecules spread out through the water. It's not that the ink molecules can't come back together to form a drop of ink right in the middle of the glass of water. It's just that this state is one out of a truly huge, and I mean it's greater than something like 10 to the 50th power, number of states. If each state is thought to have the same probability of occurring, the reconstitution of the ink drop state is hugely improbable. A way to think of this is that you think of having, like trillions of identical coins. There's a 1 in a trillion chance that all of the coins will come up all heads because there's only one way to get to that kind of state. Instead, there's a much higher chance that you're going to get something that's about 500 billion heads and about 500 billion tails, because there's a whole lot more ways for that to happen. Now, the upshot of this is that the trend towards disorder doesn't actually require time to flow in a specific direction. Arguments from that position are actually rather spurious. Things tend towards disorder because the physical processes increase the number of states, and then the more states you have, the greater the probability that the system ends up being in a disordered state than an ordered one. That's all there is to it. There's nothing about that explanation that requires time to flow in a specific direction. Now, some philosophers will use this as an argument against what's called this thermodynamic argument for the flow of time. What they often neglect, though, at least from my reading, is a more fundamental question. Why do systems always behave in such a way as to increase the number of states in a system? In the parlance of our example, why does the system always increase, or at least try to, the number of coins being flipped? Why don't we ever see processes that remove coins, thus increasing the chance of the system ending up in an ordered state? Interestingly, we don't really know the answer to that question. And this is the actual true heart of the thermodynamic argument for the direction to the flow of time. However the universe works, it must always increase the number of states available, and so it must progress in a way or in a direction that does this. Therefore, goes the argument, this is what would determine the direction of time, assuming you hold to a realist position on time. It also should be said that this applies to both A and B series, or dynamic and static positions in time, as the first case requires that the flow of time determine what the future is and then what the past is, while in the second case it allows for a coherent determination of before and after. As we reach the end of the episode, let me make a few comments. I had originally hoped to give a broad coverage of the various contemporary positions in the philosophy of time in this episode, but as it turns out, this is an area that's got a lot of really varied positions. So instead, I decided to lay as solid a foundation as I could, and then encourage you to continue investigation on your own if you're so inclined. I think I've given you the requisite vocabulary to be able to dig around a bit in the discussions on the topic and be able to keep up, at least with a little work. Along those same lines, I've decided to stay away from the topic of time travel, as it is, in my experience, a tangled knot of hopeful thinking and complicated physics. To do the topic any level of justice, I almost have to create an entirely separate episode of about an hour in length, and so perhaps that's something we'll save for a later time. I'd like to take a moment to thank listener Adam Frank for useful discussions on the growing Bloch position and the possibility of space-time expansion as being the responsible mechanism for that. In the same vein, I would also like to extend my gratitude to philosopher Evan Butts for his input. Both of these gentlemen have added to my understanding of the topic, but if I've misrepresented some position or another, understand that the error is fully mine and does not reflect the expertise of either of these two fine scholars. Again, if you have thoughts or insights into the version of the growing Bloch universe presented here, feel free to drop us a line and we'll include your thoughts in a future episode. I hope that these last 3 episodes have really gotten you thinking and perhaps created just a bit of cognitive dissonance. I think it's that feeling of discomfort that helps spur us to learn and understand more about a subject than we presently do. For those who are interested in learning more, Adrian Bardon's A Brief History of the Philosophy of Time is a good place to start, I think. From my reading, Bardon adheres to the eternalist position, but he does a nice job of representing other philosophical ideas as well. The book has served as a valuable source for the last 3 episodes of the show. Next week, we'll finally return to our narrative of humanity's efforts to determine its true place in the cosmos. It's time to pick up the story in the 14th century and look at what the natural philosophers in the great universities of Europe have been thinking about. One hint, Aristotle's view of terrestrial motion is in for some significant revision. Between now and then, if you haven't already done so, and you use Apple's platform to listen to the show, take a moment to subscribe in iTunes. Lately, there's been some delays with podcasts showing up in the episode listings. But if you're subscribed, this doesn't affect you. So you end up getting the show a little bit earlier if you go that route. Also, if you haven't already done so, we'd love it if you would leave us a strong review on whatever service you use to keep up on the journey. It's very important for us in building an audience and reaching more people. Also, in that spirit, if you know someone who would enjoy our particular brand of exploration, why don't you take a few moments to let him or her know about us so they can join the crew. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, full sails on your journey.